Look, it's my unique pleasure and my honor to introduce Victor tonight here at Dover. So let's give Victor a warm Genesee Beach welcome.
The Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, for those of you who don't know it, has been for the last 25 years at least the hippest planning agency in the nation. That's a direct quote from an author of the authoritative book on the subject, Mike. And it shows every time you do something. And I know that this room and this street have the fingerprints of the good people at Treasure Coast, like the late Dan Carey and Dana Little and Marcella Camblor and the like, all over them. So it's especially fun to talk about this subject in this place. Streets do matter a lot. I've meant to challenge you from the very beginning with the title, the art of street design. But wait a minute, isn't street design a technician's thing? You know, something that we do according to standards manuals and it's machine-like? No, not exactly, actually. We do have standards books and all of that. But the business that we're in, urban design and town planning, used to be actually called civic art. That's how it was described. Because instead of just thinking about the city in a mechanistic way, like it's a collection of plumbing and wiring and structures, there's actually about making places which required artfulness, not just making sure that those structures stood up or that wiring connected or that the plumbing flushed when you asked it to do so. And the places that we remember and the places that hold their value, the places that have strong community character are useful for their owners and for those who just visit are the places where artfulness is part of the mix. And it's on display in this space. I have to make a confession. I do have the best job in the whole world. What I do is I get to, it's not even a job. We go around the country and we make pictures of places that we don't like very much, turning into places we would like a lot better. And we help local communities decide what they want to be when they grow up. And we help retrofit the places that have proved brittle economically or coarse or short-lived and try to help them forecast and design by drawing lines on a map what they would like their town to really be and how it might be more permanent and more resilient. So that kind of work, that before and after business is the business that we're in. And it's very rewarding work. Now, 30 years ago, when we started our company, and not too long before that when we were in school, Joe Cole and I would tell you that at that time, in our classrooms and in conferences like the APA conference or in the big important meetings with government agencies, it was an open question whether main streets would come back to life. It was an open question whether the old parts of town would ever be revitalized, whether the inner cities would ever be popular again. It was an open question whether storefronts on a sidewalk where pedestrians walk back and forth was a technique that would be relevant to customers anymore. And the good news is, 30 years later, that's not an open question anymore. That question has been answered because our cities are revitalizing. Fully half of the downtowns in the great American cities have already undergone a dramatic urban regeneration and transformation. The other half are getting started on it. And our main streets have roared back to life. They're facing new problems, however, in a coming era that will mean a new focus, just like the one that started about 30 years ago with the beginning of the new urbanism movement and smart growth. A new focus will be required on streets. Now, I don't give up on any place. This will be familiar to Tom Cooper and Polly Cooper, who used to live near there in South Miami. I don't give up on anything. I don't give up on US 1 because I realize that cities are, these artful cities especially, are forever works in progress. They are like giant works of art that have many, many hands working on them across generations. We don't actually get to meet all the people with whom we're collaborating when we work on cities because they might already be dead or might not yet be born. But if you think about it in terms of before and after or change over time, you realize that this, even in Florida, where a lot of our places like US Highway 1 have been built in a somewhat slipshod and unpleasant kind of way, they're just barely started. In a blink of the eye in architectural time, they will be changed. Anyone recognize that street? Oh, come on. Yes, very good. That's Clematis Street. That's Clematis Street when the cars looked like that. So not very long ago, when I was a kid in the last years of the golden age of the automobile. The free-flowing condition was what the traffic engineers set out to create, and they did it. They did it in downtown West Palm Beach by making all the streets one way and squeezing as much capacity for automobile traffic as they possibly could out of those streets. And they did it by pushing the pedestrians all the way up against the sidewalks as far and as close to the buildings as they could get them, so they had a lot of space for roaring cars during that 15 minutes at rush hour when all of the men in the gray flannel suits were on their way home to the shiny new suburbs. And that's what Clematis Street looked like. And you probably know Clematis Street today is quite different. But as a result of, this is a computer sketch, as a result of a transformation in the early 1990s, Clematis Street got slowed down, put on a bit of a diet, made a little narrower, made two-way, and they brought on-street parking back in a bigger way and revitalized the street. But they're not done. Actually, work in progress. We're working on a next evolution for Clematis Street. What it might be like if we took that procedure of diminishing the cars just a little bit, just a slight demotion in their importance, and promoting the pedestrians and the cyclists and the seating and the shade, what the street could be like. So right here, not far away, in downtown West Palm Beach, this street debate is raging once again. Like, what should it be when it grows up? Now, along the way, we discovered that street design was the one thing without which you could not succeed. It also turns out to be the most important thing to do and the thing that's gotten wrong the most often. So in the end, after waiting and delaying on it for a long time, we finally wrote this book on street design as a textbook. And the mission was a little bit subversive. The idea was that someone like Mike or Mr. Smith could go into a meeting with the representatives of the transpocracy and slide the book across the table and point to one of the 500 pictures in it and say, how come our town can't have a street like that? And every time somebody tells me they did that with the book, I think it was worth it to spend 3.5 years writing that thing. You know, John Massengale, an architect in New York, and I collaborated on the book, and once we settled on the topic, street design, we thought, well, this is going to be easy. We'll be able to knock it right out. We've been working on street design for 25 years. This will be a piece of cake. We'll have it done by Christmas. And 3.5 Christmases later, we finished, but it turned out we had to, along the way, burn a lot of our idols and forget a lot of what we thought we knew and rethink it. And we measured, we traveled, we took 18,000 new photographs. We went out with measuring tapes and measured streets that we thought were successful or others had pointed us toward, and others that didn't seem so good, and tried to develop some useful rules of thumb that might help more cities unlock this secret to being all that they could be. Now, that's the ad for the book, but I don't want you to buy one, actually. I would prefer you bought a whole shipping container full of them and pass one out to all your friends and all your elected officials and your county transportation officials and what have you. And now you know why we did it. One of the realizations we came to when we started traveling again and looking at old streets and even older streets was that our legacy, our inheritance really, in street design is enormous. Street design has, from the very beginning, been a hallmark of advanced civilizations. Anyone recognize that street? That's the Appian Way, Via Appia in Rome. And as I said, all streets lead to Rome. And in fact, the Romans used street design as their primary technology. They did a few things like standardize the spacing of chariot wheels so they could get the stones in the right place. And they standardized dimensions, just like the FDOT. And they used that to communicate with the empire. And they did that at a time when transportation and communication were kind of synonymous. They were really one thing. And I would argue they also, in the process of making it more efficient and keeping tabs on their empire and moving goods and services back and forth and moving military back and forth, that they also did something else. And that's that they sent a message through the design of these streets about the aspiration of their community. The streets were a communications device because you could stand there and look at them and get the feeling for what they were trying to tell people about their civilization. And I think that's still true on a street like Clematis Street. Clematis Street wasn't communicating very much when you saw it widened up in one way and with the 1960s cars zipping back and forth. But now it does communicate something very strong. It resonates with people. And that's why it's so crowded on a weekend evening, for example. Back when those first rounds of improvements in the 1990s were done, Clematis Street didn't have the benefit of all those parking garages a block away that they have today. They didn't have the benefit of the trolleys running back and forth. And they didn't have the benefit of a big downtown residential population, all of which is true now. And so Clematis is evolving a lot. It'll be fun to watch what we do with our inheritance, whether it's on Jensen Beach Boulevard or on US 1 in Stewart or on Clematis. But think about it, Americans, just to fast forward to something slightly more recent than the Appian Way, Americans were really, really good at this, as good as any civilization in human history. We used to do things very carefully, like position a civic building, in this case with its dome there, in just the right way so that it caught that vista as you look down the street and didn't just convey goods and services back and forth, did it? Sent a message. And not just through the architecture of the building, but through the architecture of the neighborhood, the layout of the street itself, and the idea of aligning that cupola on that axis. This simple street is the one where, when researching the book, it all finally started to make sense. This is in Stockholm. And I was there in the winter. It was 5 degrees Fahrenheit when I shot this photograph. But I saw this beautiful row of aligned trees, and I saw the fellow on the bicycle coming toward me in the distance, light snow, Floridian, shivering, waiting for the photograph. And I took a knee and I waited for him to get just close enough that I could get that photograph just right. And I realized as he approached that he was whistling. Now it was 5:15 p.m. He was on his way home from work. He was having the time of his life. How many of you on your commute at the end of a hard workday are having the best experience you'll have during the day? You probably walk to work. There you go. You get that vista. It's all about being outside. So this fellow was whistling. He was having the time of his life. And I realized as I was staring at him, and I remembered eventually to snap the shutter, that the reason that was possible was because someone had bothered to draw lines on a map and draw dots on those lines where trees planted in a row, aligned, would form this beautiful alley of trees, like a great room line where the trees are like columns lining it. And so now, this guy, without probably ever thinking about the architect or the urban designer or the engineer, has this experience as his daily commute. That's what I mean by our inheritance. This is the kind of gift that you can give to people when, as a stubborn elected official who says, no, the trees need to line up. Or as a dedicated traffic engineer who says, no, the pace of the cars needs to be slow and we need room for the bicycle and pedestrian traffic too, not just the automobiles. If you do those things, the rewards will be paid back for generations as they are with this guy. Now, as we traveled, it became pretty apparent that a few things are the same from street to street that gives that kind of pleasant and comfortable feeling, and a few things are different. In fact, a lot of things are different. As we travel, we see cultures develop their own conventions. In Spain and in Argentina, you can find the Ramblas street type, which has a wide median that's park-like down the center and is the gathering space. That's in Buenos Aires. In Coral Gables, you can find that George Merrick, the founder of that new town in South Florida, was thoughtful about the planting of the trees, just like our friend in Stockholm. And while that's not a bike route, when you drive down Coral Way under the live oaks on a morning after a little sunshine, a little rain brings the resurrection ferns to life, you get this experience because they drew lines on a map and they cared about how it would turn out. Or this one's in Pacific Grove, California, where the streets are open at the end to the view of the ocean off the cliff. So even though we can't actually see the water of the Pacific from this spot, everybody on that street knows. They own a piece of that water, that ocean out there and that vista down there because their street opens to it. So it brings the experience and the knowledge and sense of where you are from the waterfront all the way inland. Or look at this one. This is in Yellow Springs, Ohio. The street gives you a sense of when you are in the changing of the seasons. And it has that special experience because Horace Mann, the great abolitionist, also instructed his architects that the building at Antioch College should be aligned with the street so that it sent a message, just like the one we saw in the example from New York. Well, so Americans were good at building streets. You probably had a sense of that already from your own travels. Americans were also really good at installing transportation facilities for transportation purposes, but they didn't think that those were two different activities. In fact, they are one art. So, anyone recognize this one? That's St. Charles Avenue. It's a very famous St. Charles streetcar running down the center. So when they installed a transportation facility, they also created a great address because the street runs down the median, the grass goes right up to the rails. And then they planted these big live oak trees on both sides of the street on the sides of the median, essentially making the street into a linear park that made every street along it, whether for a house or a business or a Catholic girls' school across the street, made every address prestigious by the design of the public realm between the buildings, not just the private stuff on the lots themselves. And it's interesting, too, that they didn't actually fence off the streetcar from all other modes of travel. You might notice these little ruts here in the street, or in the between the rails. Anybody want to hazard a guess what that is? This is the joggers. The joggers run down the St. Charles streetcar line, and then they hear a little ding ding, and the streetcar is coming from behind them or in front of them. They take a step to the side. 7 seconds later, it's gone by. They step back onto their well-worn path and continue their exercise. They built a transportation facility, and they built a wellness facility at the same time that encouraged people to go out and live active, healthy lifestyles. Did they realize they were doing it? Did anybody say, hey, maybe we should put an 8-foot-high fence with concertina wire with the razors on it circling the top to make sure that nobody combines these things or interacts? Now, as things progressed, we kept on with the transportation facility idea, but we forgot about some of the other types of transportation besides cars. This is a transportation facility. It speaks volumes, right? It's also a commerce facility. This is what Walter Kulash used to call the cellscape, where the only thing you can do, really, once you've made a street that unwelcoming to anyone who is not in an SUV, is put signs on it and sell people things at speeds that are slower with every passing year as the congestion grows worse and worse. So it's worth looking back at the difference between how we did it when we were really good at making streets and comparing that to what you just saw in the picture from Miami-Dade. This is Broadway in New York in 1908. So this is after the invention of automobiles and after they had begun to enter the city. You can see some Model Ts down here. But before we began to really redesign the city around them, before we criminalized crossing the street, calling it jaywalking, and before everything was channelized into its own special spaces. So the street itself was highly unspecialized. Broadway in those days had a cable car system. Actual cables like in San Francisco ran under Broadway. These are the cable cars here. And that's the old New York Herald building, which from the time when newspapers built buildings that looked like Italian villas or palaces. It's like a palazzo. And that down at the end is the Allied Chemical building, later the Times Tower at that time, and later Allied Chemical. That's the building that the ball drops down from the other direction in Times Square. So we're just south of Times Square here. If you study this picture, I'll just zoom in a little bit so you can see it closer. What you discover is that the street is being used by all kinds of people at the same time. Cable cars are going back and forth. There are some puttering 20-mile-an-hour motor vehicles, some with roofs, some without. There are also horses and buggies and bikes and lots of people on foot. You also see people standing out in the center of the street waiting for the cable car, stepping off the curb. So the whole space was being used simultaneously by all these different people. No surprise, what happened next was the technology got a lot better on the cars. They became faster and more violent. And it became harder and harder to do this kind of shared space as the technology of the cars not only became problematic for a pedestrian that got in their way, but also it made us to sort of fall in love with speed. The faster and wider was somehow better. How we used to do it. So if you just go up the island a little bit in New York, and I'm using New York because it's arguably our densest, greenest city in a way. It's a sprawl antidote. It's also the most mixed-use, multimodal, and pedestrian-friendly city that we've got. And yet, if you look at this street back when they were building the Lexington Avenue streetcar, the busiest subway line in the world, at that time they had planks over the sidewalk because of the construction that was going on in the trench down below. Here was the space that was devoted to pedestrians, like these little fellows here in the knickers. And the buildings alongside Lexington Avenue were these great, proud New York brownstones. You can see the architectural detail and the stoops and the light well here to an English basement. And what happened after organized motordom demanded more and more and more of the space was that from the same angle, what used to be this much space devoted to pedestrians became that much. And actually, if you look closely, this is the same building. See the little remnant of the architectural detail? Someone invented a saw capable of slicing off those stoops and all this beautiful architectural detail while they were also getting more and more of the street and filling in that light well so that the basement was now a mean space of much less usefulness. So even in our most pedestrian-oriented city, where the car has been demoted to its lowest status, perhaps, of any other American city, that's the kind of change that we made. There is more to this story, because fast forward to modern times, and the corrections have begun to take place. When Jeanette Sadiq-Khan became the transportation commissioner under Mayor Bloomberg, she used the vast power of that office, which had in previous generations only been used to make more car space and to make the cars go faster and faster. She used those powers on behalf of the pedestrians and the people on bikes. And she came out here and in the middle of the night painted the roadway with epoxy paint, hauled in boulders that they had left over from parks projects, and movable tables and chairs and some planters with potted trees in them, and created this little plaza in front of the famous Flatiron Building. I had to put that in there, Tom, for architectural continuing education credits. That's the Flatiron Building. There. Tell the AIA I got that in there. What's interesting is that the New Yorkers knew immediately what to do with this space. They came down the next morning, they sat and rearranged those movable chairs. They knew exactly how to use this space, even though for the preceding 60 or 70 years it had all been asphalt car space instead of people space. So what this has to do with is rediscovering the idea that our transportation facilities, otherwise known as streets, are actually public spaces. And in the hearts of our cities in particular, we need to be very careful about how we curate those. Now, the space between the buildings can either be relatively unpleasant or it can be relatively attractive. And I just use these two to compare. We call this the public realm. That happens to be Fayetteville, Arkansas. I love this sign, which, in case a wildlife biologist observes this habitat, they want to let you know what kind of creature you might actually observe in the wild in this location. But as you can probably guess, you won't see very many of them because it's not a place where people actually want to be. If you compare it to this one, which has cars and deliveries and fire engines and commerce and dense housing and office spaces and tech startups and young people and old people and all of that, it is a place where people want to be. And yet the space is not more generous in terms of its acreage, it's tighter and more intimate. So the spaces where people want to be seem to have a few things that come up over and over and over, and I'm going to show you 5. But we can look at American examples, like the street in Galena, Illinois, that is perennially named the best main street in America by all those magazine votes. Or if you look at our leafy residential streets, this is in coastal South Carolina, and begin to realize it has to do with not turning our backs on that public realm. Now that's not an old street. That actually, everything you see here was built in the 1990s. They just built a new street the old ways, and again, the pedestrians immediately knew what to do with it. They didn't do this. Now how about that? It turns out that design matters a lot, because here's the bad news. These two streets are exactly the same. They have exactly the same future land use designation on the future land use element map in the comprehensive plan. They have the same land use, single-family detached residential houses. The lots are the same size. The density is the same in terms of dwelling units per acre. So what's different? The difference is that in the one that doesn't seem too attractive, they forgot which side of the house was the front. They forgot where the front porch belongs. Forgot, actually, not they didn't forget, they built this house after we began to enshrine on the front of the structures that priority that we had come to place on cars, just by default, maybe not even without thinking about it. So I think, in a way, a lot of our challenge now is about fixing those places that we've already started. A lot of this retrofit involves restoring the address quality that you saw, and some of that means using growth and change to make things better rather than worse. So we draw a lot of pictures to illustrate how building more can actually be your opportunity to make it turn out more like you like it. You might actually be able to occupy the land with more people and more businesses and more of those social and economic transactions we hope cities are for, and yet feel its character has been strengthened rather than diminished by the arrival of those new souls and by having them close together and by building on the vacant lots and capturing the lost space. Now, we said a lot of public meetings these days will hand out keypad polling devices. This is one we've passed out in South Miami, this one, and several hundred people. And we asked them this question, and they pressed the button on their little keypad. Did their parents tell them about walking to school when they were kids? And of course, in an audience like this one, where a lot of us are of an age where our parents did exactly that, not surprisingly, a huge number of people said, yeah, my parents told me about walking to school. They said they walked 5 miles to school each way, uphill both ways, right? Remember that? In the snow, you heard all that. So then you probably guessed where this is going, but we asked that same group, well, what about yourself? When you were doing that, when you were in school, did you walk or bike to school? And still a large number did, not as many, but a pretty substantial number. And then we asked them about nowadays, the kids in their family, their kids or their grandkids or their neighbors' kids, do they walk to school? Now, safe routes to school isn't the only indicator of a successful community. And in an era where school choice has been elevated to a really high priority, it isn't always possible to get everybody to walk to a neighborhood school, and we get that. But there's something revealing about this, that in the course really of just one generation, we could go from here to here. And I'm going to say I think a lot of it has to do with not remembering the few basic characteristics that are easy to remember. And so, Commissioner, this one is intended, this is aimed at the elected officials in the audience, because people bring you proposals all the time. And you have to decide which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones. And here are 5 things you can use. Not the only things only tests that you might subject an applicant to, or that you might quiz the transportation department or the traffic engineers or the consultants with, but at least 5 you can use. These are 5 things that in building up the book we realized occur over and over and over. The first one is that the streets that are successful seem to have a shape. And that's that they are defined either by buildings or landscape or both. Sometimes it's the street trees, like in the example with the whistling guy on the bike. Sometimes it's with buildings or those front porches like the one you saw on that leafy street. But in any event, when they're done, the street feels like a space that has boundaries. It's has a sense of enclosure. Technical term is spatial enclosure. And that enclosure is proportional. It isn't just infinitely wide, because that isn't actually better. It responds to the geometry of our own eyes and our instincts as humans and tries to hit a good proportion, generally more square than wide. At a certain point, that proportion of height of the things on the side that make the walls of the room to width of the space between them, if that proportion gets too wide, the sense of place diminishes. Now, you can do that with tall buildings in a big city, or you can do that with small buildings in a little city. So this is Sunset Drive in South Miami, and those two buildings in the foreground on the left were designed by Mahdi, who's sitting right over there. My wife, architect, designed these two. And these are little buildings, but they have their location on their lots, and they have enough height to them to give the street that sense of being an enclosed public room. And it turns out that's one of those places where people like to be. That also is how you build building-to-street relationships. Sometimes it's a storefront, and sometimes it's like this building, which has a more civic presence toward the street. That's an example of a grand attempt at the same thing in Huntsville, Alabama. I love to use Huntsville because they have this really quaint, small downtown with a beautiful square. And these old traditional buildings had the building-to-street relationship down pat. On the high street, the storefronts are right along the street, and on the secondary street, they have a little more setback and room for outdoor dining or dooryards and green and what have you. And if you stand on that corner at Madison and you look to the left, you see this building, which has a really positive building-to-street relationship and positive sense of spatial enclosure and shape. If you turn your head a little bit to the right, you see the city parking garage, which does not do any of those things. And so right there, Tale of Two Cities, you can actually see two different building-to-street relationships. Where would you prefer to live? This is not really a test. I hope I know which one you would pick. So the second of these tests is the comfort level we feel there. Part of that has to do with responding to our climate. So what we found is that although great city streets vary from culture to culture, they also vary according to where you are in the world. So for example, in a temperate zone, this is Norfolk, Virginia, the deciduous trees are really crucial. They do something pretty magical. In the middle of the summer, they let that dappled light down into the street, and they keep everything down below cool in the shade. So they shade the buildings, lower their air conditioning costs, and make you happier as a pedestrian walking along the shady street on the sidewalk. In fact, if you park there, you're also happier. If you drive there, you're also happier. So that's what those trees do in the summer when the sun is up at a really high angle. Now in the winter, they lose their leaves and they let the sun in at the lower winter angle, and they warm the spaces inside the buildings, and they melt the snow off the sidewalk and that sort of thing. So that's a pretty simple kind of adaptation for comfort, right? When we were poorer but smarter and we didn't just try to live inside little bubbles of cars or buildings, we would always do things like that to make it more comfortable. If you go to a hot and sticky place, this is Barcelona, you'll find a different set of prescriptions that are conventional for producing that same comfort, like a canopy hung wide over the street. And buildings are a little taller, so they throw the majority of the street space into shade for more of the summer. Now here's a Florida example. So in the Sunshine State, you would think we'd be better at it than this. And especially given that all the technicians involved, through their own codes of ethics, and in fact the laws, through the standards in the law that give local governments the authority to standardize things and to set zoning and so on. All of that is based on the idea of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. That's in your AIA continuing education credits list as well, Tom. What do you think? How are we doing with the public health, safety, and welfare in the case of this guy? Not too terribly well. And as you know, he's probably walking along that median because he's waiting for a break in the traffic, and it's so far to the nearest signalized intersection that he has to walk and walk and walk if he's going to cross at a crosswalk, if there's a crosswalk there at all. And the significance of this, of course, is that he will be blamed for having made a mistake if he got hit by a car, that didn't see him in the dark of night, or if he ended up in an emergency room with heat stroke or whatever, they'd say, "What were you thinking?" to this fellow. I would suggest that the mistake is not just his. Now, in the cities that get it right, something else magical happens. Remember I said something about exchanging of social and economic exchanges? Those transactions. The cities, those communications devices, their streets, are actually places where we exchange ideas. And if you can come person to person into contact with other people, the ones you know and the ones you don't, you're much more likely to exchange those ideas. There's a kind of synergy that goes on in places like Palo Alto, California, on their main street, where, because they have that place and that experience, smart people are bumping into each other. This group is 1 block away from the headquarters of the British Broadcasting Corporation. This is a busy, bustling part of London. And there's a lot of traffic. But on this street, they said to the traffic, the pedestrians come first, because the crosswalk is elevated here, and it's made very narrow, the space where the car actually goes through. And if you look at the texture on the road, there are all sorts of signals here. The sort of cranky geometry, the tight turn, the narrow lane, going up and across and down over the speed table at the crosswalk. All those are signals communicating to the motorist that you're allowed to be here, but you are not the dominant apex predator in this habitat. The pedestrians are king. And that's why these guys, on foot and on wheels, have a chance to exchange ideas. So as for the public health, safety, and welfare, nothing slides this mission into focus like seeing old people waiting for the bus in the sun on the side of the road in a Florida street. This fellow was actually a pretty good sport about this. We took his picture first and then asked him for permission to use it. And he smiled broadly when we rolled the window down and said hello to him. It was as if he just snapped out of the funk you see him in this picture. A human spoke to me in public. And I think it probably made his day, but unfortunately, he went right back to sweating in the sun and not being taken care of. So the comfort, it's basic. We should top off our bus stops. And we might not ask ourselves as often, why so few people take the bus? Third on the list of 5 is connectedness. Cities are about bringing things on purpose into network with each other, to connect. That's what they're for. And if we sell community, if we draw community, we bring those connections to life. If we sell isolation and remoteness and getting away from everybody else, then we design it that way, then we get low density, sprawl, and the worst traffic ever. So it's not that hard to figure out why that is. If you compare a little tissue sample of the woodlands in Texas, one of the high water marks of 1960s and 70s auto-oriented sprawl, you will be able to count 36 intersections per square mile where you can actually keep going without having to go back the way you went in. So the cul-de-sacs don't count. If you advance to the late 1980s, early 1990s, and an early example of new urbanism planning at Celebration in Central Florida, they did a lot better. 10 times the intersections per square mile on a tissue sample the same size. So they were starting to regain this idea of the connected city pattern. But just so we don't get too cocky, let's compare that to Rome, where a tissue sample of the same size has over 1,000 intersections per square mile. Now that might be a little overdoing it, but we just, the point here is we are just kind of getting back in touch with our human thousands of year old instincts about how to network these streets together. Now, let me show you why, purely from a traffic planning point of view, that's so incredibly important. Now, if you're a pedestrian, you know it's important because small blocks mean you can walk around the block. And you have numerous places where you can cross and ways you can go. Right? So pedestrians get this instantly. But as far as driving goes, there are also big advantages to network streets over the tree-like pattern of conventional suburban sprawl. In these 2 diagrams, which were done by the great Walter Kulash, you see the same number of lanes in both. This is actually the same amount of asphalt distributed onto the ground. But in the one that has more intersections, there's more capacity of every kind. You have more ability to absorb a larger number of vehicle miles traveled per year per person. you can absorb more turns taking place simultaneously. There's more time, called clearance time, for cars to get out of the way so other cars can move. So, and then, of course, you can phase the signals, so you can get the benefit of advanced signal timing. Let's look at it another way. If you want to go from A to B, and there's only one route that goes there, so one street in that direction, that's the direction you're going to go, from your origin to your destination, right? But if somebody bothers to put just one more street parallel, then you have, stay with me now, a second way to get from here to there, right? It's going to get more advanced. If somebody starts to create just the beginnings, the semblance of a grid, another street in each direction, how many routes do you have to go from A to B? Well, you get this one, you get this one, you get this one. There are actually 6 in all that don't include any that are doubling back. So all you had to do was think of the city pattern in the traditional way, in which is divided into a network of smaller blocks, and you get lots of ways to go from here to there. How about 4 by 3? That's 35 ways to go from here to there. Or 8 by 8, you get 12,870 ways to go from here to there. See how it works? It's like logarithmic. There's actually math involved. I'm not going to hit you with the formula. But the power of this is on display in that map, the map of Beaufort, South Carolina. Beautiful traditional town, typically voted #1 on the list of places to visit or retire. What if you care not at all about capacity for traffic and doing something about all the congestion at the peak hour, but you care a lot about global climate instability and sea level rise, and you want to know how to lower your carbon footprint, and you're doing things like making short trips instead of long ones so that you have less tailpipe emissions. It turns out that building more densely and building mixed use drops your carbon footprint for obvious reasons, because you put things closer to where people were. You move the origins and destinations closer together, less tailpipe emissions. However, not so obvious is that as we increase the network of the street, the number of intersections per square mile or per acre, the carbon footprint can also drop like a rock, because the shortest possible route can be found by the people making those trips. 4th on my list is safety. And now, it's not because it's 4th in importance. It's probably top of our list. It's a threshold thing. If we don't feel good about being out there, whether we're on 4 wheels or 2 wheels or 2 feet or 2 wheels that are side by side instead of one behind the other, safety is everything. And the way to get safe is to make small things. More smaller streets, smaller lanes that are designed for slower speeds, smaller intersections. Look at this. This is in Forest Hills Gardens, where they have the tennis tournament. And look at that tiny little radius on the granite curbs on that street. And also the tiny little distance between the corner and the first tree on the corner. Violates every standard in that standards book I talked about at the beginning. Turns out that's a street where you will not go really fast. And this is a neighborhood where it's easy to grow older and it's easy to be a young person, because the managed speeds of the cars are not out of control. They're managed by design. So now Walter Kulash, that engineer I was telling you about, pointed out that here and there on a street like this, you're going to find little black tire marks on those curbs where somebody got a little too close in their big SUV. And all that means is that somebody got a polite, little gentle message that there might be old people and kids here in this neighborhood, so you better slow the heck down. So to get to safety, you have to make things smaller, and we have to get slower. Slow is safe, and small is beautiful. Now, when you widen the streets to make more space for all that maneuvering, the maneuvering of the fire engines that are approaching each other with their mirrors extended in both directions on the day when there's a hurricane at one end of the block and an earthquake at the other end of the block and 2 fires and a car is on fire in the middle, and all those scenarios that they planned for, because the experts got all the asphalt they wanted according to their standards here. The great Liz Plater-Zyberk, former dean of the University of Miami School of Architecture, says, when the technicians and specialists get 100% of what they want, you never get better than a 60% sense of place. And I think that applies to safety as well. This is a street where we can go as fast as we want. It's just like the street where they filmed that scene in Breaking Bad where, So another way to look at the connection between speed and safety is in this chart. When, unfortunately, there is a collision, we don't call them accidents because somebody designed this street to be dangerous that way. But when there is a collision or a crash between a pedestrian and a motorist, and that motorist was moving 20 miles an hour or less, there's a fatality now and then, but only 5% of the time. Still not good, but really infrequent. However, a tiny little uptick in speed to 30 or 40 miles an hour, and that same collision will be fatal 80% of the time. So just little increases in speed lead to very big increases in mayhem. And that's a lesson for us in designing our streets. We should ask ourselves, why are we designing the streets for a default design speed or target speed of 35 or 45 miles an hour? Is it because we know this is going to happen, but really, just now and then, it's not that bad? I hope that's not your kid or your grandmother that is the one that turns out to be the fatality. Now, some people have suggested that we give pedestrians bright orange vests and flags when they cross the street. Couldn't resist. Something tells me that it's not that the pedestrians are dressed wrong when we have collisions, that the streets aren't designed right. In fact, Abbey Road has what nowadays we call a high visibility crosswalk. And what a proud tradition that is. The reason that sort of speed thing is important is shown by this cone right here, which is published by the National Association of City Transportation Officials, a direct rival with the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. Hear that? State highway versus city? Well, in the city, they know that if you're going fast, like this person is going 30, that's how much of the field of vision in front of you through your windshield you can really take in and act upon. And if you were going 15 miles an hour, which is at the top, you'd notice that there are people entering the roadway on that crosswalk and other things like that. And since you're going slower, you have more time to react. So even if there is a collision, you'll be going slower and it'll produce an injury less often. And you might not hit them at all because you have a chance when you're going slow to put on the brake and let the situation resolve. Now, there are other ways to get safety, including giving pedestrians and people on bikes more of the road. In this case, a separated bike lane that is shared by taxis and buses. Interesting, bus and bike lane. The way they do this one, they know those are professional drivers, and they give a big piece of the road to the people who are using green mobility options instead of driving alone in their own car. And they did that even though they knew that in less space left over, the cars were going to be more congested and take longer to get to their destinations. So they are rewarding the transit trip, the bike trip, and the pedestrian trip, and the short trip. And they're not rewarding the long commute taken by somebody who insists on driving alone from however far away it was they decided to move because they drove till they qualified. Okay, see how that works? Now, this picture is useful another way. There are 3 different kinds of cyclists visible here. Here's a mammal, a middle-aged man in Lycra. He's clipped in, he's in the drops, he's wearing the sports equipment, he's got a helmet, and he's exercising. Now, this young lady is dressed more casually. She doesn't have a helmet. She's dressed in casual clothing. She's sitting upright on higher handlebars. She's got fatter tires. And she's going to and from something else. And then there's this fellow who's commuting. You can tell he's older because he's getting a little gray, and he's got his work clothes on. He has a backpack, and he's taking a break on the side of the road just to catch his breath and wait for the right moment to continue. So you see, it turns out the wildlife in this habitat are all really varied and have very different needs. The spandex cyclist is probably comfortable driving and riding that bike in traffic, whereas the others are probably not. And so a protected space, here a separated bike lane, turns out to be a lot better for them. Or look at this street, which has cars. But it's also just given less of the space for those cars and more of the space for pedestrians and for street trees and for seating and for bike parking and so on. This is a street designed by Jan Gell in a curbless fashion, like the way we are studying for climatometry. So here's the lesson for the traffic engineers in the room. See at least one. They like to call walking, biking, and transit alternative modes of transportation. They are not alternative modes. They are the original modes. Okay, so anyway, if you hear them say alternate modes, speak up and say, I walk, and that's not an alternate mode. If you're into this, and maybe this is a little morbid, but if you want to know more about it, a good place to look is a report that comes out every 2 years. There's a new one for 2016 called Dangerous by Design. And this is collected by the people at Smart Growth America and Transportation for America. They have an interactive map on their website. If you Google Dangerous by Design, and you can put your mouse over or zoom in on any of these little dots. Every little dot is a fatality. So this is the morbid part. And when you mouse over that spot, a window will pop up and it will tell you the age of the person that died, whether they were male or female, what time of day it was, and so on. You can zoom in on the map and see whether it was in the middle between those distant crosswalks or in an ordinary busy street. You can see where the collisions are concentrated. If you haven't looked at the map of Jensen Beach or Stewart or the Treasure Coast, I suggest you do it. You'll find it very informative. Last thing on safety is it turns out that the stuff we do for active living and for better interaction between people and therefore better mental health actually turns out to be just as important as slower speeds. These are the factors that scientists assembled for what makes it more likely that someone will survive into the next decade. They actually got a bunch of people, 750 people from all walks of life in a sample that were 45 years old. And they asked them a ton of questions about their lifestyle and so on. They filed that all away and they waited 10 years. And they went back and they saw who's still breathing, who's still alive. And then they went to see what the correlating factors were. And it's very interesting that the one where people are networked together are these top two things come about because of that ability to encounter others at home and in public. They're even more important than strapping on the Lycra and spandex, and more important than losing weight. Now the last, I'm sorry this is jumping, is that the bright line doing that? That's a freight train. Now be real. The last of the 5 criteria is a little more elusive. It's that the streets that seem to go from being pretty good, ordinary workaday streets to being the ones that people really love and come back to and will pay extra for that address are the ones that are memorable in some way. And this will be always memorable because it was jumping up and down when I was talking about it. Yeah. We'll see whether these pedestrians settle down in a minute. The one on the left is Brooklyn. It has its own way of making memorable streets, and if you visited that place where all the young people seem to want to move, then you know why. Because the street corner experience you can have in Brooklyn is like no other place. This one's in Bologna, Italy, and it has to do with the fact that for the last 400 years, somebody who lived on that street could come down here and buy fresh fruits and vegetables from this guy and his ancestors. And so what makes a street memorable will vary from place to place. It might be something grand and it might be something modest. Whether it's a place where the dimensions themselves make it likely that the little people can survive is a good test. And never underestimate the power of one street tree. That's in Micanopy. One oak tree with some Spanish moss on it, changing the composition of that whole artful scene. Oh, look at this one, lots of trees at once. This is a street designed by the great John Nolan, who designed 30 new towns in Florida, designed West Palm Beach, designed Venice, Florida, and a number of other places. This is Myers Park in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he was very far ahead of his time. Nolan said, we should plant native trees. 1914, 1923, no one was thinking about planting native trees. They were thinking about planting whatever tree you could get quickly. But he observed the woods around Charlotte and he said, if we use these particular species, we know they like this soil and we know they like this weather, they're going to thrive. And then he specified that for every house, he had to plant 6 trees, and he specified where they should go, including those lines on a map along Queens Road here. So now if you're sharing the road in that place, you have this experience in a car or, and as Nolan intended, maybe someday on a streetcar. You have the experience of moving through that climax forest with the ceiling overhead, the canopy that's kind of like a Gothic cathedral's roof arching overhead. An amazing thing, and all because somebody bothered to draw that in. And that's how I made it memorable. Or you can add an Arc de Triomphe. It's another way to do it. This is a memorable street. Yes, the Avenue Diana in Paris has the Arc de Triomphe at the end. I consider that a very useful urban accessory. If you have an extra one, install. But one of the reasons I remember this street isn't just because it happens to have that famous monument at the end of the street. It's because this is also the world's most beautiful parking lot. They park on each block of the Avenue Diana in several parallel parking lines that are along those beautiful tree lines that you see right here. They park more than 300 cars per block. So basically they accomplish a Walmart parking lot level of parking spaces per acre, and yet they built a beautiful street. That's a place where people are happy to be. And Eiffel Tower is also great urban accessories. If you have one of those, put it at the other end. Or consider this bike trail in Holland. This is in the Netherlands, and the artist who installed this was inspired by Van Gogh's Starry Night. And they used reflectors and mirrors and flashy tiles and little photovoltaic lit LEDs, and they reproduced the Starry Night under your wheels as you ride. So like, you get the idea? It's not just a transportation facility. It's civic art. It is really hard to get to memorable when you have a very limited menu to work from. And that limited menu comes from a pretty notorious diagram that's in the main traffic engineering manual that suggests a false choice. Like, you have to choose between access and mobility. That you can't mix these two, and that depending on whether you want more of one or the other, you're either going to have an arterial street, a collector street, or a local street. In other words, there are 3. They actually divide the world one more time, and they say there are 2 classifications. There are rural, by which they mean suburban, and urban, or urbanized, by which they mean suburban. And that's it. That's the menu. And so this diagram, which actually appears on the cover of a Wisconsin road engineering manual, suggests that tree-like pattern that's the opposite of the connectedness I spoke about in the beginning. What happens in this hierarchy of simplistic street designs is that the most local street is the least connected to anything else, and you work your way from out on the end of the branch onto a bigger branch and onto the bigger branch and onto the trunk. And that's the tree-like design of the modern freeway system. All you have to do is start building your community or your county that way, and then add a little population, add a little water, let it grow, and you get this. Because the system required that everybody ends up at the same intersection at the peak hour. Do you see the problem? Because we've all got to use the same trunk of the same tree. And so eventually they metastasize into being these enormous lurching spasms of concrete that we can hardly afford to fix, much less build. That's part of how they destroyed Overtown in Miami. So the mission John and I eventually settled on was that we needed to use the textbook to help restore this bigger menu, remind people that there were lots of different kinds of streets. And so we created pages and pages of diagrams and photos that describe main streets and skinny streets. This one's in Philadelphia. How's that for narrow? And even skinnier streets. This is a pedestrian-only space in Charleston. And step streets like this one in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We've forgotten that we could augment these big, busy, angry, motorized streets with lots of other kinds of streets where the cars are demoted a bit. And then eventually we arrived at not 3, not 4, but 11 types. And if you look at the 500 pictures in the book, what you're going to discover is that within each of these there are many, many variations. From the leafiest, greenest ones that we follow in the parkways, from the wide streets that are multi-way, boulevards, the main streets, and Elm Streets, and all the way down the menu. How much more likely are we to succeed if we can build a lot of different kinds of street habitat for those different members of our species instead of just a few? Now, part of the menu is that you'll discover most of those streets can accommodate street trees, shade trees, not just palm trees that look really nice, but don't throw much shade on the sidewalk, but actual shade-producing shade trees planted with details that will allow for them to grow big and spread out. This is a street in Coral Gables. So that fellow George Merrick I talked about earlier, he and his team knew how to do this. They created streets like this, just by habit, good habits. It was just natural, organically done for them. Or the notorious Robert Moses, when he built Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, used street trees as organizing elements on the Upper West Side in New York. This is a neighborhood we designed in Davidson, North Carolina, where we knew there would be older citizens. We have any older citizens in the Treasure Coast region? So we knew that when they went for a walk, they would need trees, and so those are now starting to get bigger. And I think, it is important to realize that not every rule is 100% of the time, right? Nothing is absolute. In fact, and so here's a street in Belgrano in Buenos Aires, which is great without street trees. You know, the occasional lean-in tree from down the block, and that very tight building-to-street relationship that gives the shade they need. And people love this street too. So it's not to suggest you can't do it with architecture. You have to do it with street trees. Most of the time, you should. Now, I've been going on and on about narrowness and small, but I want to make a pitch here for the big streets, because sometimes we have to have a big road, US 1 or what have you. And this is the Avinguda Diagonal in Barcelona. It's a very hard-working street. It has so much traffic per day that it makes US 1 look like nothing. And yet, they have room for the beautiful street tree canopy and exclusive lanes for the transit vehicles so that the transit is not stuck in the same traffic that the cars are, and wide sidewalks for the pedestrians. And guess what? A prestigious address, even on the busiest, kind of exhausting street that one is. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but this is a 19th century road widening project from back when public works officials were still heroes in their communities. They took the tangle of the street in southern France of that old medieval town, and they straightened it out. They rationalized it. And they also planted the street trees and made the wide street a great street. And in the process, they created the postcard picture of their community and a street of great prestige where everybody wanted to put their gallery or their restaurant. Americans did this too. Oglethorpe, in his plans for Savannah, set aside certain streets like Oglethorpe Avenue for the linear park treatment down the center of its median. And if you know Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, it's very wide from building face to building face. It's still a lovely place and a powerful statement. Or you could do this. Now, Martin County would never do this. Palm Beach County did this. This is Palm Beach County. I do like the bike lane. I think this is really hilarious. Notice that we, again, do not observe any members of that species in this habitat. How do we get to streets like that? And I'll explain to you how that's done. There's a very simple thing. Based on mechanical calculations of the level of service at an intersection, transportation planners, traffic engineers will see that as the need rises, as more and more people come to use the road, eventually it will rise over the years until it exceeds the capacity of the road according to that math. And you have to do something. Well, you endure it for as long as you can, and finally you say, it's gotten so much worse, we got to do something about the traffic. And the something is we widen the road. And that's how we get one of these, just so you know. Okay. And at that moment we say, okay, now finally we've taken care of the problem, because we did a design year, the 20th year, and we saw how much was going to be needed, and we planned for that because we're being foresighted, and now it's all going to be fine. And you know what happens, right? What actually happens is that the new road, which was built to make it possible for people to go fast again, simply encouraged them to go farther. Remember that drive to qualify wisecrack I made before? more of that. And so people say, well, now I've got this big road. Why don't I live way out there? I'll get away from it all. And then everybody else will also get away from it all, and they'll come out there and clog my streets again. So what do? We widen the road again. And we do it over and over. What's actually happening is now it's understood, and it really wasn't when the modern traffic engineering and transportation planning systems were enshrined. What's really happening is called induced travel demand. By adding more capacity, by making it feasible to go far instead of fast, we just encourage more people to do it. We bring out more latent demand, and we get congestion again, no matter what. Don't expect this to get a whole lot better with autonomous and connected vehicles, by the way. I'm an enthusiast for self-driving cars, partly because I ride my bike to work, and I can't wait until the computer makes it go the right speed and then stay the right distance from me when I'm trying to share the road. But that said, today we have a lot of people who are organizing their whole day around avoiding too much peak hour travel. And so parents, mostly moms with the minivans, will, for example, chain together a bunch of trips in the latter part of the afternoon. They'll, picking up Johnny and Susie and then horseback riding lessons or piano lessons or wherever they go, or to get an ice cream cone. And they'll chain those trips together, and they basically a lot of their time imprisoned in that vehicle. But they do everything they can to avoid the congestion at its worst, and of course never fully escape it. In the era of the self-driving car, what do you think is going to happen? Once Johnny and Susie and Jason and Jennifer get big enough, Jason's going to go off to horseback riding lessons in one vehicle, and Jennifer's going to go off to piano lessons in the other vehicle, and Mom's going to meet her friends in a third one. And now instead of having one car on the road at the peak hour, we'll have three. And what else? Seinfeld's parents. Seinfeld's parents always went to the early bird special because they hated to drive at night and they didn't want to drive in the rush hour traffic. So they were at Denny's at 4 p.m., right? Once they can press a button on their phone and an autonomous vehicle, or even today an Uber and Lyft, will show up in their front door and take them wherever they want to go, whenever they want to go, they're going to go back to eating at a reasonable hour. And maybe drinking too. Thank goodness they're not behind the wheel. But the point is, don't expect the amount of cars trying to move around and use all these intersections to go down. It's going to go up. And we need to be thinking about that. Now, there are some bright sides to that story, like needing a whole lot fewer parking spaces. So we should talk about that. But the real lesson is in a great statement by Glenn Heimstra. Get it? It doesn't work to add more notches, more holes to your belt, to eat more, and it doesn't work to try and widen the roads to deal with traffic congestion. Good news? Yeah, there is good news. One is this kind of recovery from amnesia that's going on in our lifetimes in America is resulting in some new streets that are really neat. This is in a neighborhood we designed in Colorado. Peter Swift designed this street as a traffic engineer. And so it's called Swift Street, not because you can drive swiftly, because it's really narrow and bumpy, but it's really slow. In fact, there's a little smooth area for the bikes in every lane, and then the rest of the road is rough, so that people will be reminded pretty constantly that that's a street where you're meant to go slowly, Swift Street. But also look at the building to street relationships. Those are being restored. So even in an arid place where these trees will take a long, long time to get very big, it already feels comfortable despite the fact that it's new. So if you look at new streets that have been built in the last 20 years, you're starting to see some recovery from the amnesia that I described. This is a two-way street, but there's parking on one side, and there's not two full lanes to the outside of that. So what happens? It's a yield street, where when you get to the narrow point, and you see someone else coming, you pull over and you let them go by, and you wave to your friend in the neighborhood, and then you go on and use the street yourself. And the yield streets used to be a common part of the menu and have only just begun to be built again. That's a brand new one. And Florida's been getting better and better at streets as well. This is a new street in the Panhandle, designed by Duane and Plater Zyberk. And it's a lovely street, despite the fact that it's new. So our confidence should be going up. And I'm actually hopeful that our confidence in this region will go up soon. You've probably been reading in the newspaper about Knight Kiplinger's plan for his family property on the north end of Martin County, just south of Port St. Lucie, the so-called Pineland Prairie Project. And should that get approved, it's going to be a showcase for new thinking in street design. The traditions that Mr. Kiplinger wanted to plug into with this project were the traditions of old Florida towns. And you can begin to see in the street vocabulary and in the building architecture, in these sketches, that kind of idea. Here's a look at what we hope the main street in the Pineland would be like at the tiny town center. So maybe even around here, new streets before long. Now, new streets, but what about the old streets? Are they done? Can we fix them? And the answer is yes. We can fix old streets. We can transform the streets we've inherited into things we would like a lot better. We call this retrofitting streets. This is in South Miami. That photograph was made when Mr. Cooper here was the vice mayor in the city of South Miami in 1992. And it used to look like that, and now it looks like that, which is pretty amazing. And what's interesting is that in the process of slowing it down and adjusting the amount of space for cars, it also became a place where people wanted to be, and sort of instantly, almost overnight, became the social center of the neighborhood. Now it ranks a walk score of 95, and on the map of the city, of the city's real estate, where the brightest colors are for the most valuable parts of the tax base, that's the brightest spot in the whole city. So this topic of retrofitting streets is really important to us. So we devote a whole big fat chapter in the book to this, and we went out and looked for examples of how we might take 100% auto space and make people space again. And like this one, this is a pretty interesting example of Main Street. Looks like a nice, proud street with nice retailers and nice lighting, right? What you don't get from this view is that it's actually sitting on top of the interstate. This is the cap at Union Station in Columbus, and they actually built a street over the highway that had divided their town into pieces and reunified these two neighborhoods in the process. Isn't that kind of amazing? So I think the retrofits can take all sorts of different forms. We can take there it is in cross section. 670 goes underneath, and the High Street goes on top. Isn't that pretty astonishing? Take all kinds of forms. My favorite retrofits are Worth Avenue in Palm Beach and Kensington High Street in London. Kensington High Street was a real auto sewer where the cars flew back and forth toward Heathrow Airport to the point where they got so fearful they fenced the pedestrians in with wrought iron gates. I'm not making that up. It was like, in fact, they call them the pig pens. The pig pens, as if the pedestrians are livestock. And that's the way Kensington High Street looked not very long ago at all, and now it looks like this. They kept the cars, they kept the double-decker buses, they kept the taxis going back and forth to Heathrow. They just slowed it all down, and that gave them permission to use the space differently for street trees, and for bike parking. The details of this are really extraordinary, which makes me think human beings in modern times can in fact do this well. I also like the bike parking in the middle of the street. You notice this pedestrian who didn't look for a crosswalk. They just go back and forth. Because the cars are moving slowly and there's a lot of eye contact, there are many opportunities to move back and forth in the street. It's like 1908 all over again. It's also an interesting design in terms of the materials. The colors are muted and simple. It's not got anything bright yellow or flashing orange or painted green or highway-like. These simple little stainless steel studs, that kind of thing. Now, we are just beginning our conversation in our country about what's called complete streets. You may have heard the movement, Complete Streets movement. I love it. It's a great bumper sticker of a name, isn't it? Who'd want an incomplete street? However, we're just starting to do things like stripe some of that extra pavement for bikes and paint it bright green, the same exact color of green that's used in the highway exit ramp signs. It's the highway form language still finding its way onto our streets. So in an effort to make the street better, they did in fact make it look better. I have to question whether they really made it complete. What does a complete street really look like? It looks like this. This is a street where there's traffic going back and forth and delivery from lorries, bus rapid transit, protected bike lanes, a subway underneath, big arching street trees over the pedestrians, and great addresses for a lot of people to enjoy. That's a complete street. So here's a test. If it's ugly, it's not complete. Okay? It's not yet a complete street unless it's a beautiful street. And there are a lot of examples right here in the Sunshine State where we are seeing this resurface. In Coral Gables, they have a 60-day experiment underway with these planters where they took a lane for a on-street bike path and they separated it from traffic, these big, heavy concrete planters, and actually they're quite beautiful. They seem to fit in George Merrick's Coral Gables. You can see Jennifer here riding down the street quite happily compared to when she shared that same space with cars that were going way too fast in all that asphalt. So this is a simple, pop-up, low-cost way to get the complete street thing going in their town. In time, the hope is that those streets will be formalized with something more permanent, like a new tree line missing. I told you, before and after, it's how we think. So I will argue that it's not complete if we still have pedestrians doing that every time the shift changes at the hospital and they have to walk across the street. Our peer cities are doing amazing things in this regard. In Atlanta, the planning director declared the days of treating our downtown streets like glorified on-ramps to our expressways are over. And they declared in this whole area of South Downtown a pedestrian priority zone. I suggested it, and they said yes. But a pedestrian priority zone, so the streets are being changed. Here's the old one-way street with extra lanes. Here's the new street with less space for cars and more space for outdoor dining and biking and planting trees. This is Mitchell Street, and here's Mitchell Street after the intended transformation. So Atlanta's doing this. If they can do this in Atlanta, we ought to be able to do this in Florida. Now, this isn't just for fancy neighborhoods and people with a lot of money to spend on elaborate finishes and expensive addresses like the Swift Street in Colorado. It's also for bringing back to life parts of our towns that have been humbled. One of those can be found in Chattanooga in what's called the South Side. These are 3 neighborhoods. Rustville, that's really the name. I'm not making that up. Fort Negley, which they called Fort Neglect, and Jefferson Heights, all the neighborhoods just south of the Chattanooga Choo-Choo. And in the mid-1990s, it looked like this. It was a neighborhood that had been abandoned. Many of the structures had been burned or razed. It was the wrong side of the tracks. And very, very little remained, actually. Their main street, 100% of the storefronts on the street called Main Street were boarded up on that street. So they had a lot to do to fix this. And the Lyndhurst Foundation and the Chattanooga-Hamilton County Planning Commission knew they wouldn't be able to do it all at once. That Main Street would have to come later, for example. They started here, and they started with streets. So they adopted a street-based revitalization scheme. And the first thing they did was make a new street right here to connect pieces of 17th Street that had been disconnected. And they made those new addresses. And so here's the aerial photograph then and the aerial photograph now. And all of the real estate development that you saw pop into that picture before and after was started by that 1-2 block street segment, which at first just looked like this. It was narrower, it looked like a real street-like street with real street-like street trees, and it didn't go forever without being interrupted. It had a little square. And it's an architecture school town, so people started designing really cool looking buildings next to it, and it has examples of traditional architecture and historic architecture. And they, in just a few short years, they restored the confidence in this downtrodden neighborhood. People started coming back and reinvesting in the historic buildings, like the lady from New Orleans who came here and started a fine Cajun restaurant. The artists and the cyclists came, the shock troops of urban revitalization. And those artists started plowing around in all those abandoned backyards and warehouses and finding all sorts of cool rusty stuff that they could weld together to make garden walls and fences and gates and like that. And they made it into a place where people started coming and spending time and starting businesses. This abandoned building now looks like that and has the best restaurant in Chattanooga. All of that, what you just saw, happened in basically a 17-year period. It was in a blink of the eye in architectural time, and all because of streets. We might do well to remember the advice of the great Lewis Mumford. who said, "Build the cities for lovers and friends." Thank you very much.